Welcome to chapter 1, or I'm sorry, I always say that, chapter 1. Welcome to chapter 7, session 1. And this time we're going to be talking about the power of story. And everyone has a story in their life. And I often think, we read these great stories on the news, or we pick up a book at Barnes and Noble, and we're like, man, that was a really good story. But when you think about your life and you think about the highs and the lows that you've been through, the challenges that maybe you didn't overcome, maybe they overcame you, or maybe you think about the stories where you were really like the hero. I got to tell you, we all have a story to tell. And so this is going to be an opportunity to look at our story a little differently. And so in order to illustrate that, I'm going to start with the story, which is what we always do when we open a new chapter. And this particular story is really personal to me because this is about my dad. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about my father. And so if you can picture a circle with a pie, like a pie. And so actually, if you'll go to the next page, you'll see it at the bottom of your page there under the life lesson. Think about your life and how each slice represents a different part of your life. Well, in my dad's case, in the last few years of his life, my dad wasn't very well. And so he had a lot of different health problems that were physically painful for him. And so toward the end of his life, he became more housebound. He was, had an oxygen tube with him, and he'd had a hip replacement, and he had other health issues. And so he just pretty much sat home and watched Judge Judy and watched cooking shows and do what you do when you're kind of stranded at home in the twilight years of your time. And so my dad did that. And as we know, if you're in a lot of physical pain, and of course he was bored and he couldn't get out, and that was probably really a depressing kind of experience for him. And so when you're not feeling well emotionally and mentally and physically, then what happens to your attitude? Well, of course it goes down. My dad wasn't any different. And so, he'd get, maybe wasn't very happy and maybe complained a lot. And if you had met my dad during those last 3 years of his life, during that period of his time, how would you have characterized him? Well, you might have called him a grouchy old man, a grumpy old guy, not a friendly person, someone that's not interested in your life, just as interested in his life, and about complaining. And so you might have walked away from that experience thinking, I'm glad I never was married to that guy, or I bet he was a brute to live with. And but let me tell you about my dad. Okay, so my dad was a cowboy in Wyoming, and his grandparents immigrated here from Scotland. And so, yes, I'm Scottish. And so he was an only child. His parents had a ranch in Wyoming. And as the only child, he said that he used to tell me that he was really lonely growing up. Now, he went to that one-room schoolhouse and graduated from high school at 16 years old. And he was actually voted the most dreamy. And I have a picture of him as a high school senior. He was 16, and he was pretty dreamy, a beautiful Scotsman. And so he decided that he wanted to see the world. And how he decided to do that was he joined the military. So my dad joined the Army, and this was during the Korean conflict. So he was shipped out to South Korea, where he was in the military police, and it was his responsibility, along with some other soldiers, to guard the prisoners there. And I used to ask my dad, tell me about the North Korean soldiers. What were they like? And my dad was just one of those men that just liked everybody. And he said, these guys were good guys. They were just on the wrong side of the border, during the war. And they were human, just like you and I were, or you and I are. And so, so on one occasion, he told me this story about how he, being from Wyoming and being a cowboy, he felt like it was his responsibility to educate the rest of the world on the joys of being a cowboy from Wyoming, because he was very proud of that. And so he decided to have a rodeo with this when he was at this camp. And so he talked all the other soldiers into kind of buying in on this idea. And So they waited for the general to leave, and they got a couple of horses and some donkeys or whatever else they had, and they let all the soldiers out, or I'm sorry, all the prisoners out. Of course, the soldiers were still around guarding them, but they were out there. They were going to be in the audience. And so my dad did this rodeo for them. And there was a guy on lookout that when the general was coming back, he was supposed to give the signal so they could all, get back to where they needed to be. And so Dad is doing all this rodeo stuff for all these prisoners, and they're all cheering and they're having a great time, and the signal comes, the general's coming. And so they make a mad dash. They get all the prisoners back into their cells and resume their duties, that, hey, nothing's been going on that's out of the ordinary here. And so and so he always thought that was such a great story, and I thought that was a awesome picture of what my dad would do, because my dad would do that. And so, and then what happened is that during these periods of time, they would want to give the soldiers some rest. And back in those days, they had these programs called USO. And so these soldiers would come to different parts of the country, and they would have these parties that were held for them by the USO. And so my dad had some leave in California. So he went to this party, and, they have punch and dancing, and girls are there to, talk to the guys and that kind of thing. And so my dad said that he saw this lady standing across the room, and she was this blonde hair, blue-eyed woman. And he said, as soon as I saw her, I fell in love with her. And that would have been and is my mother. And so he went up to her and thought she was just the most beautiful thing on earth. And she was Swedish. And so he said, can I dance with you? And they had dance cards. And so he put his name on every one of the dances. So they danced all night. And it was New Year's Eve. And so at New Year's Eve, he kissed her at midnight. Well, then he was shipped back to South Korea, where he was stationed. And so he spent the next few years writing letters to her. And she told me that she fell in love with my dad because of the letters that he wrote. And towards the end of the letter campaign, when he was getting ready to be discharged from the military, he asked her to marry her through a letter. And he did this by saying, in a very typical country, cowboy, Wyoming way, he said, "We go together like peaches and cream." And so she said yes, and they got married in California, and then they moved back to Wyoming, where he had a ranch, and they started working. But in her mind, she was probably thinking it was going to be like the Ewing Ranch in Dallas, and it wasn't. It was a very small home, and they had an outdoor privy, so an outhouse, and so they had a pump well inside for the water. And so she said she learned to cook because she had one cookbook in this hand and she was stirring in the other hand because she had to cook for all the ranch hands. Their very first wedding present when they got to Wyoming was a sow. And so this little piglet came to them, and my dad was thinking this is going to make some great bacon, and my mom said, "No, we can't kill this pig. It's just too cute." So that was their first marital family pet, called Sweet Pea. And so that became the family pet. And so they began to live life together. And during the first 6 months or so of their married life, my mom contracted polio. And so she was very ill for a very long time. And then she recovered from that, thankfully. That was really miraculous, her story about recovering from polio. And then they eventually moved into town. So my dad then, over a period of time, he became involved with the Veterans Administration system. And so he ultimately became the chief of supply for the Veterans Administration. And he did a really good job, and he was glad to retire, though. And but during our time growing up, we literally grew up on a stereotypical Western community in Wyoming, and we lived on Main Street. And we would, in the summertime, we would hear the Crow Nation having their powwows that they would meet up at the fairgrounds. And I was pretty young at the time, and I remember sitting on the front porch with my dad in the evening, and I asked him, I said, "Dad, should I be afraid of the Indians?" And my dad said, "I'd never, ever better hear that you have ever mistreated somebody that is a Native American. He said, because I will spank you if you mistreat them. These people got a bad rap. They're wonderful people. They're human beings just like we are. And so you will always be kind to them. And that was, again, my dad. My dad believed in doing business on a handshake. He was just what you saw is what you got. And he believed in everybody. He just had a really good heart. He was the vice mayor at one point in our community. And we actually went through, I remember walking through the neighborhood with him. And he would collect a nickel from all the neighbors so that we could install a light in the alley behind our house, so that for that whole neighborhood, so that we could have some safety. And he wanted that for his children. He had 5 kids. I'm the youngest of 5. And my dad was an avid hunter and an avid fisherman. And as he got older, he, said he couldn't bring himself to hunt because he just felt really sad for the animals. So his heart was really tender. And so, now, my dad was getting older, and he had retired back in Wyoming, and then he started having some health problems. And before he passed away, it was a real sudden thing. And my daughter and I happened to be up there at the time. And I was with my father as he was just really declining quite rapidly. And I was sitting by his bed, and he whispered to me, he said, I need you to go back home and pick up some money out of my wallet. And I want you to go to the store and buy a birthday card for your mom. And I want you to write in it that I love her. Now, this is very touching for me because my father, had been married to my mom for 50 years. And he knew her birthday was the next day. And he remembered that. And so I did that. And I went to the store, and I got a card for him, for my mom, and I wrote in it what he said. And he passed away on her birthday. And that was very, very difficult for us as a family because my dad was such a strong man. And so it was just incredible to me that his last words were how much he loved my mom. And even though they had rocky times in their life, the reality of it is that people do the best thing that they can in the day. And despite the ups and downs that all families have, my dad always loved my mom. And I thought that was so incredible that his last words were about her. And so now you know my dad. You know some of the ups and downs, the funny stories about my father. He raised 5 kids, and he was from Wyoming, and he was a cowboy, loved people and believed in treating people well all the time. And so the point is that one little slice, that dark slice in the last 3 years of his life isn't my dad. My dad is the whole picture. That would be my father. And I want to remind you that that is you, because many of us, so often, we experience these difficult times, these dark times, and maybe they go on for several years. Maybe it's not just a short period of time. Maybe it's 5 years. Maybe you've gone through some difficult times 10 years. The point is, your story isn't finished. And it doesn't speak to what your story was before. And so I love this because now you know my dad, and people want to know you. And even if they've met you during just this dark period of your life, you need to remind them, this isn't who you are. This isn't the sum of your life existence. There is so much more to you than the short period of time that people have met you. And that brings us to our 7th life lesson. And that is, my life is a combination of who I was, who I am, and who I will become. Let me say that again. My life is a combination of who I was, who I am, and who I will become. I want you to think about that and start reflecting on that, and reflecting about not just the dark pieces in your life, but the times when there were brighter days, and brighter days are yet to come. I'll see you at the next session.